Where does Hideo Kojima get his ideas? In this podcast, we take a deep dive into his brain and shed light on his creative process. Hideo Kojima presents Brain Structure.
こんにちは、小島秀夫です。ポッドキャストプログラム、Hideo Kojima Presents Brain Structure.
Hello, I'm Hideo Kojima, here with the podcast program Hideo Kojima Presents Brain Structure. Today, I'm here again with my partner for the show.
Hello, Brains here. Today, we also have a guest, Director Mamoru Oshii.
どうも、こんにちは。
Hello, nice to be here.
You two haven't seen each other in quite some time, correct?
6年ぶり。
Around 6 years, I think.
Have you known each other very long?
Around 26 years or so. I came to Tokyo in 1996, not too long after going through the Kobe earthquake. At that time, I was making a game called Police Knots, and when we were working on the Sega Saturn version, Mr. Mamoru Oshii and I met and had our first conversation. After that, we became friends. At one point, Mr. Oshii called me up and said, "I'm with Cameron in America, and we're going to go shoot some guns. Do you want to come with us?" At that time, I couldn't go though, but that's what our relationship has been like for 26 years.
By Cameron, do you mean James Cameron?
はいはいはいはい。
Yes. I wish I had gone with them, but I couldn't get out of work. After I became independent in 2016, I went to go see Mr. Oshii and we had a meal together, but we hadn't seen each other since then. At that time, actually, we had a plan for Mr. Oshii to come to my studio and get a 3D scan done of him so he could appear in Death Stranding. But he had a broken bone at that time, so I didn't get to see him. After that, he did an interview for us, but I couldn't fit into my work schedule. So it has been 6 years since we've seen each other.
なかなか機会が
We weren't able to make time, and then the pandemic happened, so it really has been quite a long time, hasn't it?
まあ、押井さんのでも本とかはじゃあ
I've read Mr. Oshii's book, though, like The Essence of Film, The Law of Sequels.
Only available in Japan.
You're embarrassing me.
Although I'm sure many of our listeners are already aware, I'll take this opportunity to introduce Mr. Mamoru Oshii. In 1983, he directed his first film, the original movie adaptation of the TV anime, Urusei Yatsura. After directing his second movie, Beautiful Dreamer, he became a freelancer. He worked as the visual storyboard designer and director for Mobile Police Pet Labor, from its OVA, original video animation era, to its first film adaptation, Mobile Police Pet Labor the movie, and its sequel film, Mobile Police Pet Labor 2 the movie. In 1995, Ghost in the Shell became popular overseas, and its sequel, Innocence, was the first Japanese anime to be nominated to compete at the Cannes Film Festival. In 2008, The Skycrawlers was nominated to compete in the Venice International Film Festival. Mr. Kojima, how would you describe Mr. Oshii?
押井さんはどんな方僕が
I mean, what can I say? I think he's really well respected around the world. Of course, I watched Urusei Yatsura when it aired on TV, so I was aware of him from the point already, but I really became a fan during the OVA era. Do you know what that is? Original video animation. VHS videotapes. I was already involved in the game industry, but at the beginning, I was staying in a boarding house and was watching VHS tapes. That's when I first encountered Mr. Oshii's mystery article file, 538.
これびっくりしました。
I was really surprised. It probably couldn't be aired on TV at that time, but the OVAs of that time period were really gritty and Mr. Oshii became known throughout the world. The story was like Angel Heart. Of course, I love films, and I'm sure Mr. Oshii loves films too. European films like Trier and Melville, and other examples like Angel's Egg and Stalker. There weren't really any other anime out there like that. At the time, I didn't have a VCR and couldn't watch Angel's Egg or Dallas, but I started with his mystery article movie and was really impressed by the Pat Labor movie series. I really admired him. I couldn't believe there were anime like that, a visual feast focusing mostly on thrill and suspense without the robots as the main attraction. French and European films have a similar feel, right? That first scene with Motoko and Ghost in the Shell is like one of my favorite movies, Melville Samurai. I mean, Avalon is basically Anje Vita. Avalon is live action film that I really love. The aesthetic is really great. It's a little presumptuous of me to make a commentary on it, but things really changed before and after Mr. Oshii's animation style. I mean, Disney's Snow White was a full animation.
もうカメラフィックスでもずっと動いてるんですけど。
Even when the camera is fixed, things are constantly moving. That was impossible to do with Japanese hand-drawn animation. With hand-drawn animation, you can do camera blocking. And with Hayao Miyazaki, he was very particular about movement, like the character's actions running up a wall diagonally or how the waves roll with the wind. But with Mr. Oshii, he's aware of cinematic camera work and layouts, like his lens work with that really distorted fisheye lens. Even Hideaki Anno imitates it. I bought Mr. Oshii's book, The Patlabor Method. At the time, I was working on adventure games and we couldn't move the camera around in that medium. Now you can do longer camera work with CG, but at the time you couldn't. I think Mr. Oshii was the first person to really consider layouts and storytelling. And Mr. Oshii likes films that has worked on anime and live-action movies, and he's even written novels. I like films, but decided to make games, and that's why I think my work is a bit unique. Similarly, Masaki Yamada, for example, is a novelist, but got his start in films. Katsuhiro Otomo is the same too. He started with an interest in film and then began drawing anime. Nowadays, people grow up watching anime, then make anime. Or they grow up playing video games and then make video games. That's the difference. I think it was really a fight with Mr. Oshii to make his work. For me too. People would say, anime is bad education, or you can't do this in anime, or it's different from movies. But Mr. Oshii fought and finally made it through, ultimately creating a new culture. And now his work influences other creators all around the world, and that is really impressive. RoboCop 2 copied him. That scene at the end of Patlabor. And the Wachowski sisters have copied everything too, and so did Guillermo.
いや、それパクったって言っちゃうと
People will get mad if you call it copying.
オマージュ
An homage then.
Maybe inspired by or with respect is better. I mean, if you call it copying, then animation is all made by copying live-action films.
そうですゲームもそうですけどね
Yeah, so are games.
まあゲームってさ、それをアニメーションで歴史を
Video games follow a similar path as animation, but at a higher speed. Any new media is a form of entertainment. Animation really took off after World War II and has continued to develop in the decades that followed. It copied and absorbed a lot of things before creating its own original style. But games did the same thing in about 30 years' time. The technology developed really fast. I really feel that looking at the NES system. Games evolved very quickly, and the structure of the industry and expression as a whole have really changed too. I think games as a form of entertainment are going to continue to change dramatically. Now, everything is becoming mobile. Only the very serious fans have stationary game consoles, right? I've played games since the NES system, and the work that Hideo has produced has changed quite a bit since the Policenauts era. His ambition hasn't changed, and neither has his outlook or his choice to go in hard with the tiniest of details. But the way he expresses these things has changed. With each of his releases, it has changed. I was really surprised when he released The Phantom Pain, and now recently with Death Stranding. I really feel that change. The reason changes happen in a person has a lot to do with individual effort, but I feel that it also really moves in sync with the changes in media. Of course, you always need to work within your media's parameters. It's the same with both anime and games, like budget, for example. Anime in particular, if I'm going to be honest, is always a battle with the budget.
ゲームも予算とか
It's the same with games.
いやそうだけどほら
The
桁が違う
amount
から
is different, though. There are probably 2 more zeros in a game budget compared to an anime budget. I've never worked on an animation that had a budget surplus. Maybe Innocence? But the rest were really budget battles, so you really have no choice but to do your best with composition. You have to try to create actuality and reality through expressions. The realism of a fantasy world is lost when you move things around in animation. Ironically, the more you move, the more it feels fake. So I decided not to animate a lot of parts.
But that only works because it's your anime and you make it work. You go see an anime because it's moving animation, only to find that yours doesn't move.
A special type of knowledge is necessary to make a movie that can be expressive without much movement. You work with composition. That usually requires layout or camera work, and sound too.
Yeah.
You can't compete in the movie industry without doing that. I didn't particularly love anime, I was just a movie guy. Like you said earlier, Melville, Tarkovsky, etc. I had a huge admiration for European movies. And through that admiration, because I'm a movie guy, I just happened to start working in an animation studio.
タルコフスキーでうるせえやつらありえんじゃないですか。
It's hard to get Urusei Yatsura from Tarkovsky.
やっぱ楽団とだらけでね。
A guy who talked about names like Godard was suddenly working in an animation studio doing Yatta Man. I didn't know what to do. I was doing all of that while thinking about what I would do if I was the director. I learned a lot, but you need the technology. I'm sure it's the same with games, but you can't express or do anything without the technology there. The first 3 years, I had my hands full with just learning everything. And then I started thinking about how I could bring some part of myself into animation. I couldn't figure out how to make it my own or how to express myself in my movies. I wasn't sure what to do. I needed people to help me. But most animators in the industry are generally super conservative.
職人だからさ。
They are craftsmen, after all.
いやいや、それはもうゲームもそうですよ。
It's the same in the gaming industry.
やっぱ技術だって
I guess experts in a field have the tendency to become conservative. They have pride in their work. So when you try to do something a little bit different, you stir up conflict. But people on the sound team are often willing to try something new. People working in the sound industry are constantly encountering new things, trying to find the true sound of something, or searching for something interesting to do. They simply want to have fun. The people who make art tend to be introverted. It's not really in their nature to try making something as a team.
ここ重要なところですからね。
That's a pretty big issue.
だから基本的にまずは現場との戦いなんですよ。
There are a lot of battles when you work in animation. You battle with sponsors too.
It's usually those on the inside that first reject new ideas.
So there is a lot of resistance? How do you combat it?
それはそれぞれの
Everyone has different temperaments, so you have to change your battle style each time.
なだめたりする
Calming them, coddling them, flattering them, getting angry at them, threatening them.
おしさん
When I first got to know Mr. Oshii, he invited me to come see him work on this sound remix thing for Pat Labor 1 and 2. Mr. Oshii was there alone that day in this huge studio, and when I listened what he was working on, you know, in games and anime, do you know what rendering is? When there's a scene involving rain, you can't just draw the rain. Even in live action films, you can't really see the rain. Akira Kurosawa made the rain black, actually. Anyway, when rain starts pouring in real life, you know. You know that rain is falling, but in movies or anime or games, you can't process a lot of rain in real time. So what you do is, you add sound. You add the little sound of rain. They did that in Pat Labor. They emphasize the sound of each raindrop. When you remix a scene with the sound of the rain on the roof, the whole environment feels different. Mr. Oshii remixed it very precisely, and I do that with my games too. It's that sort of thing that makes Mr. Oshii really special. He just builds up all the tiny details.
Is it tedious work?
まあいや実は結構面白い。
It's more interesting than tedious. Sound engineering gives you a lot of bang for your buck. If you want to try something new, it usually doesn't take a lot of money to do it. Recording the source sound may cost a bit of money, but when you mix the tracks, if you take your time, you can really close in on the sound you imagined. For example, Skywalker Sound in San Francisco has about 100 times the number of sound sources than Japan does. And if you ask them to record something new, they'll do it right away. In the Skycrawlers, we needed the sound of a Porsche. But not just any Porsche. We needed a specific Porsche sound. And we went looking for it and recorded it on the spot. We also needed the sound of Basset Hound nails. Making sound is something you can do pretty quickly, and the results are immediate. But animating something takes a lot of money. You can successfully make sounds in a lot of different ways, depending on how you approach it. It really is very quick. When I have the opportunity to, I do radio dramas. You can make them very quickly. If you write a book, you have your product in hand in no time. It's a really cost-effective way to produce something.
まあゲームもそうなんだけど、日本の映画って
In a similar fashion, well, I suppose you could say the same about video games too, but Japanese movies don't want to spend money on sound production. Even if it's a huge project, they try to pull it off in a week. Animation usually does sound in about 2 months, and we set aside the budget so the money doesn't accidentally get spent somewhere else. Or if we have an advertising budget, we would forcefully steal from them or do other bogus stuff. If you don't plan it out like this, it becomes a budget battle. What will we spend the money on for this project? If you really want to use Skywalker sound, you'll need to cut costs from somewhere else.
僕も行きましたけど、もう全然環境からちゃいますからね。
I went there once, actually. The whole place was crazy. I saw it and thought, great things can be made here. The lunches and everything were crazy too. Like, what the heck is this?
そうまあもう入ってからスタジアムまで
Yeah, after you enter the front gates, it takes like 15 minutes by car to get to the actual studio. But at that kind of place, you can shut out everything else and focus on your work. It's the ideal environment. It's the same for movies and for games. Creating something special is a social act. It's a form of business. Beyond just the realization of the work, you have to gather together money from all sorts of people, and you have to make more money with that. If you don't succeed, you can't make your next piece. So the conditions for success as a director are very clear, and in order to make your next work, you need to meet those conditions. There isn't any more to it than that. If hundreds of thousands of people watch your work, or if it turns out to be a big failure, if you lose once, it's over. Well, in Japan, it isn't quite that harsh, but that's definitely how it works in Hollywood.
思いっきり売れたらあかん。
And you can't be too successful either.
You can't?
You just want for your work to do fairly well. If you're too successful, you'll start to be approached by certain types of people and you'll find yourself in a tough place.
大成功するとね
Yeah, if you're too successful, then you'll face tremendous pressure to become even more successful.
おしさんね、僕は
You know, back in the day, I made the adventure game Police Knots. Mr. Oshii, you also love adventure games and made one too. Sansara Naga, right?
と恥ずかしながら
I'm a bit embarrassed to admit it.
I met him when I was making an adventure game. And then I made Metal Gear, and I really didn't think it was going to do that well. And it flew off the shelves, and Mr. Oshii was like, Hideo, you can't make something like that.
He told you that? Mr. Oshii did?
いや作っていいんだけど
I mean, it's fine to make something like that, but if you're too successful, you'll run into a lot of problems afterwards. You'll need to keep outdoing yourself to be more and more successful. You'll have to keep raising the quality to match the changing technology. And you'll have to compete with other games. A game that goes viral like that can actually be a big stumbling block.
Yeah, and it's hard to get around that block.
It was actually similar with Pat Labor, too. It was fine when we did the first and the second one, though, because the number of people on the project really didn't change. But the budget doubled.
あれ予算倍やったんですよ。
It doubled.
ゴースト・イン・ザ・シェル
And if I remember correctly, the budget increased 4 or 5-fold between Ghost in the Shell and Innocence.
イノセンスはでもすごい
With Innocence?
いや、あれはだから確かなかった。
The number of people working on that didn't really increase much. There were about the same number of people working on both the Skycrawlers and Innocence. The promotion budgets for each were hugely different, though, and that's what I had to deal with. But that's the movie industry for you. It's easiest if they only have medium-high hopes for you, and you only promise medium-high success. It's true mentally, too. If you don't have all that pressure, you feel more freedom to try experimenting a bit. The producers all say the same thing, to appeal to your former audience while also acquiring a new one. And the reality of it is that you'll lose both audiences. I've seen it happen a lot, so I know. It's really the gate to hell for creators.
だからそこそこのラインですよ。
It's a difficult line to toe. You can't end up in the red, but don't want to be too far in the black and lose your freedom. It's especially hard if you do well in Hollywood.
だからキャメロンがその一番いい例です。
James Cameron is the prime example. He made a record-breaking hit, and then he went beyond even that. That's the kind of man he is. As a creator and as a businessman, he has the strong will to succeed. He's a prime example of a Hollywood person. He went from making Titanic to making Avatar and just continued to rewrite himself. People will expect more from him each time. And now it's been 8 years since his last work. But I'm sure he'll do it again eventually, though.
But they're planning to do like 4 or so Avatar movies, right?
だって何本もやるって話でしょ。
Seriously, how many do we need? Does he really want to end his career as the director of Avatar? If it were me, I wouldn't want to. There are directors like that in Japan, too, stuck making the same series and not able to break free. One person that certainly has been requested to play the sequel game is Hayao Miyazaki, but he's never made a sequel for any of his works. I wrote about that in my book, too. Why does he...
You talk about that in your book, The Essence of Film, The Law of Sequels.
だからさ結局ね
Ultimately, you'll either have to play the sequel game or you'll have to refuse to make sequels entirely. Some people can do that. Some people can't.
僕はメタルギアずっと
I worked on the Metal Gear series for so long, but it was truly something I wanted to make. And as long as there were fans, it became my reason for living, kind of like an athlete. Athletes and astronauts, they all start with a goal like, I want to go to outer space, or I want to win a gold medal, right? And when they start winning, they gain the support of fans and they can't break free. They can't break free, they can't quit, they can't lose. It felt like that when Metal Gear started gaining fans and I started getting fan letters. I kept working on it for a while, but for better or worse, I eventually went independent and couldn't work on it anymore, so I stopped.
あとやっぱ基本的にさ僕
I hardly ever make my own stories for my work. Jobs come to me with the original work already made, and I try to do them justice. That's the good part about being a movie director. You use other people's money and other people's ideas, so in the end, who's responsible for the project? But that's also one of the more questionable elements of being a director. You borrow all this stuff from other people and sew it together. So if you want to make excuses, you have a lot to choose from. If the movie tanks, who takes responsibility? There are the producers and also the company employees. Who's working on the project as freelancers? Well, that would be the directors and the animators.
じゃあ自分がさ責任取るんだったら
So my stance is that if they want us to take responsibility, then they should just let us do what we want. But the ideas come from them, so we start to lose our will to create something on our own. I think that's something everybody misunderstands about me. I'm not really doing what I want to do. These jobs end up on my plate, and it's up to me to figure out what to use. How much to toss out, how much to add in, which characters to cut, and all that. And we edit the movie like this, similar to how movie translation works. While translating things, they start adding elements of their own into it. That's really the most questionable part about being a director, but it's also the most fun.
Hideo Kojima presents Brain structure.
Although the conversation is nowhere near complete, we are going to end today's episode there. You can look forward to listening to the second half next week.
ということで早くもエンディングのお時間です。
Now it's time to wrap things up. Mr. Oshii was very interesting, wasn't he? Far too interesting. I hadn't seen him in 6 years, and there was the pandemic too. It was great having him on the show. We should probably go out for dinner soon. I like to have him over at the studio, and there are a few things I like to consult with him on too. I think he has a lot of international fans, so I'm sure everyone enjoyed hearing what he had to say. And that's it for today's episode of Hideo Kojima Presents Brain Structure. We look forward to seeing you next time.
それではさようなら。
Hideo Kojima Presents Brain Structure is a production by Spotify Studios in association with Kojima Productions and Fam Inc. Brains, Kayleen Falls. Narrator, Owen Maki. Music, Silent Poets. Visual design, Mechi Kuro. Producer, Hiro Furuki. Director, Kohei Takizawa. Executive producer at Spotify, Asami Sekine. Special thanks to Kojima Productions, Ayako Terashima, Masafumi Chiba, Miki Suga, and Aki Saito. Hosted by Hideo Kojima.
Still listening? Can't wait for part 2, right? We'll bring it to you early next week. On the next episode, Mamoru Oshii, like you've never heard before. The fun talks continue and non-stop laughter from Hideo Kojima.